Good morning. If everyone in the back could take a seat, we will begin. Welcome to Singapore. My name is Greg Clancy. I'm the acting director of the Asia Research Institute, and opening this conference is the most important thing that I have done or will do in my acting directorship. Although I should warn you that my acting directorship lasts only a week, while Professor Prasanjit Duara, who is the director of ARI, is out of town. And the first thing I have to do is send you his regrets. He would love to be here. He had an overseas commitment that he had to honor. But this is very much his topic, connections, corridors, and communities. His favorite keyword, if you know Prasanjit, is inter-Asia. Inter-Asia usually followed by the word connections. So this is very much in the spirit of what we at ARI are intensely interested in. And for those of you who haven't come to Singapore before, a special welcome to you. And I noticed that there are 28 countries represented in this room, with only about 100 participants, so that's remarkably international, and 5 continents as well represented among you. ARI, for those of you, and that's the acronym, means Asia Research Institute. We are your local hosts, along with ICES, the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. And we use a lot of acronyms here in Singapore. The two things that you have to know about us is that we are very interested in acronyms, and that we use the word Asia more than any other place in the world. ARI, which is Asia Research Institute, is one of 5 co-sponsors for this conference, two of which I've already mentioned. The other 3 have their secretariats in the Netherlands, and we have a long history of working with our friends in the Netherlands on a variety of topics. ARI is 11 years old this year. We are the Humanities and Social Science Research Institute at NUS, and I can say that we are the institute at NUS. Not to disparage ICES, but ICES is not actually at NUS, it transcends NUS. It's a national organization. ARI is singular, because we have all of the humanities and social sciences and law and business under our rubric. We have to be very diverse in our interests. The one thing that binds us together is Asia. Otherwise, we have 7 research clusters. I had one of them, the STS, Science, Technology, and Society Research Cluster. The others are religion, migration, changing family, urbanism, and we have an open cluster because we keep ourselves open to the idea that there's other people doing other things that don't relate to our core interests. And sometimes the open cluster interest becomes a core interest, as it did in my case. We have lots of calls for applications for visiting positions at ARI on a regular basis, and I invite you all to think about those if you decide on your trip here that you'd like to potentially spend more time and interact with us over a longer period. A number of ARI staff are here in the participating. I count 13 of my colleagues from NUS on the program, all of whom are somehow affiliated with ARI, some at ARI full-time. Dr. Martin Saxer, member of the organizing committee, as you know, is here and very present, and I'm sure that any of them would be pleased to talk with you about what it's like to work and study here. We, by the way, just to locate you a little bit, if you've just arrived and don't know your way around, we are on the main campus right here, the so-called Kentridge campus. That's important if you're in a taxi to say that you want to come back to the main campus, or you don't, because there's another campus, and that's where ARI is, at the other campus, not here, at Bukit Timah, which is the original campus of NUS. The reason that we're here in this building, University Hall, which is the center of the university, with the president's office upstairs, the reason we are here is because Prasanjit Duara, director of ARI, wears a second hat as Director of Humanities and Social Science for the entire university. And he runs, in fact, a Humanities and Social Science fund under the Vice President for Research. So Prasanjit has an office upstairs as well, and we're allowed to use this building and the facilities up on the top floor because that's Prasanjat's other job. And so we have this space as well. My main task is, now that I've sort of welcomed you and sort of centered you geographically, is to introduce the person who's most responsible for this conference. And that's Willem van Schendel from the University of Amsterdam, who will say a few words and then introduce our keynote speaker. Willem is, as probably all of you know, chair of modern Asian history at the University of Amsterdam, the author of many books, most recently, and have to correct me if I'm wrong, most recently, A History of Bangladesh, published by Cambridge University Press. His main focus of his research is India, Bangladesh, and Burma, famous for coining the term Zomia, at least according to Wikipedia. I hope that's correct. And actually a person who, in a room like this, needs no further introduction. So without further ado, let me call Willem to the podium, and please give him a round of applause.
On behalf of the team that has organized this conference, and many of the team members have done much more to get this conference together than I have, I'd like to welcome all of you. Those of you who have traveled to be here, I hope you had a good trip and you're settled in okay. Those of you who have traveled a long way to be here, I hope you will not be too jet-lagged to participate fully. This is the third Asian Borderlands Conference. Scholarly interest in the study of borderlands, border societies, cross-border practices, and state policies regarding borders in Asia is increasing. If we take this conference as a yardstick, the growth is spectacular. This time we had so many proposals for panels and papers that we were not able to accommodate them all. This conference could easily have been more than 3 times its present size. One of the reasons we decided to stick to the format of previous conferences is that we think it works very well to have no more than 2 parallel sessions. And we hope you agree with us. Anyone who studies borderlands knows that modern states get very jittery if they don't know the exact location of their borders. In much the same way, conference conveners get jittery if they don't know the exact location of the conference they are organizing. Many of you will have noticed that for a while, earlier this year, that location was uncertain. We are extremely happy that our colleagues here in Singapore were willing to take on the challenge of hosting the conference at short notice. ARI and ICAS, I don't have to introduce the acronyms because they have been introduced, decided to act as joint hosts and co-organizers, and we owe them much gratitude. It's great to be here today. This conference brings together scholars from very different backgrounds, and as we've heard, 5 continents. We share an interest in borderlands, but we will look at borderlands from a range of disciplinary backgrounds and theoretical positions. We share an urge to understand international and national borders as more than lines on the ground, as legal constructs defined in treaties, or as the outer reaches of states. We explore the social, economic, political, and cultural arrangements on which borders impinge or which result from the imposition of borders. Hence, we're interested in communities in borderlands and in the extent to which their spatial location affects their formation and development. Local actors and organizations, states, market forces, and environmental factors all have a bearing on the opportunities and restrictions to the formation of borderland communities, to their growth and to their fracturing. A second theme that runs through this conference is an interest in corridors. We are looking forward to learning more about how paths and networks through Asia's borderlands are closed, diverted, reopened, or created, and what effects these dynamics have on the borderlands, but also far beyond them. An important issue here is how human mobility coexists with immobility, and how processes of rapid change are interwoven with very slow change. The study of borderlands invites us to reflect on how we deal with both time and space. The third theme is connections. The study of borderlands and cross-border connections can help us better understand social connections generally. An important point is to what extent we think of borderland connections as specific. The idea of the borderland may reveal certain connections that otherwise go unnoticed. It may also highlight the resilience of borderlands as hidden frontiers long after the actual borders have disappeared. Borderland connections may not disappear when borders do so, and this alerts us to the afterlife of borders. In this conference, our focus is not restricted to Asia's land borders. Borderlands also embrace island and maritime borders and airports. And there is a growing interest in the interactions between state borders and other boundaries and limits, those of environmental systems, trade networks, kinship, ethnicity, and mediascapes. We will hear presentations that explore these interactions and many more. We are also branching out in other ways. We are looking beyond Asia, a necessary exercise to place Asian borderlands into wider comparative perspectives. And I would like to extend a special welcome to the first intrepid presenters to mix with this Asia-focused crowd. I fully expect that all of us will make them feel at home. Finally, we will get a chance to experience Asian borderlands through images. The photo exhibition showcases photographs from different Asian localities, as we will be able to see when it is opened right after this session. But first, we're about to enjoy an outstanding keynote lecture. Many of you will know Professor David Ludden through his work, and you may have met him in person. If not, this conference provides an opportunity to do so. Let me remind you briefly of his background. David Ludden is Professor of Political Economy and Globalization and Chair of the Department of History at New York University. His research has always combined fine-grained historical research, first mostly in southern India, and in recent years in northeast India and Bangladesh, with broad conceptual issues regarding the comparative history of capitalism. At a time when many scholars of globalization and development are enamored of the urban present, he has consistently argued for the importance of studying these processes in agrarian settings and historically. Understanding inequality and poverty and the conflicts and confrontations they produce requires that we are sensitive to spatial histories. Let me quote from what he wrote recently. Localities weave into regions, continents, and global spaces. Expanding spaces of social power affect everyday life in smaller places, right down to New York neighborhoods and mountain hamlets in the global south. The scale and impact of meaningful spatial interaction pose problems for historical study. Empire and nation do not necessarily form dominant spatial frames. Space is not a stage or container, but rather a permanently ongoing construction project at all scalar levels. Spatial history entails the study of interactive, changing spaces over time, configured by social power of many kinds and at many levels of scale. End of quote. Clearly, borderlands are such ongoing construction projects, useful sites of interest for the spatial historian, or more generally, the spatial social scientist. There are many more sites, as David Ludden explores in his upcoming book, which has the working title History Inside Globalization, Spatial Power and Inequity in Asia. Today's keynote lecture looks at borderlands from this perspective, and especially from that of one form of spatial power, the territorialism of nation-states. He gave it the title Territorial Inequity and National Borderlands. I would like to invite David Ludden to present his lecture.
Okay, thank you, Willem. He's already said everything I have to say, so. Okay, I'm going to begin. And I will read, I'm sorry to say, at least until I get to toward the end, because I want to stay within time here and leave lots of time for discussion, because, as you'll see at the end, it sort of ends with a desire for discussion. I'm very glad to be here today, and I sincerely thank the conference organizers for bringing me to Singapore to share some thoughts on territorial inequity, that is, on the working of inequitable socio-spatial power relations which enclose and exclude people to create separate spaces for insiders and outsiders, keeping them apart and regulating their interaction in order to protect insider privileges, therefore infusing borderlands with heavy doses of discrimination, deprivation, and struggle, and also, at the same time, securing the righteous protection of property, of culture, collective identity, freedom, safety, and trust, which are essential for maintaining streams of investment in economic development and human prosperity. In my brief time here today, I want to sketch the rough outlines of a long-term history of borderland production in Asia, focusing on two important features. First, the ubiquitous propriety of territorialism, which seems to me to be an essentially inequitable and at the same time morally and culturally foundational process of spatial enclosure, control, and exclusion, which makes people outsiders of many kinds inhabiting a wide variety of borderlands. Secondly, I'll focus on the changing substance of border making under contemporary globalization, which is creating a new kind of borderland habitus, replete with increasingly ghoulish, frightening, spectral forms of borderland habitation inside the increasingly grotesque inequality of global capitalism. I hope we have that on the board still. Good. The photo on the cover of our really wonderful conference brochure, which is, I really congratulate the producers of that brochure. It's quite terrific. And I thank everyone for getting in their abstracts and so on. It's quite impressive. This picture provides an excellent point of departure for me. It depicts a scene that seems to me emblematic of borderland studies, not only in Asia, but everywhere that scholars study people who live in border zones. In the photo, a fence divides a social space with people on both sides, as one person strives to move across the rigid boundary, separating one side from the other. For the people in the photo, the fence is not of their own making. It is an external imposition, but also, at the same time, it's part of their lives. The people who built that fence and their logic for doing so are invisible in the photo. All the humanity in the scene resides in people who visibly inhabit this divided, fractured landscape. The fence is inanimate, inhuman, and most importantly for me here, it could be anywhere. There's nothing notably Asian about the fence or the people in this photo as far as I can see. Presentist problematics are built into the academic field of borderland studies, emerging as it has done inside contemporary globalization, which I think partly explains the expansion that Willem described. During a time when barriers built by national states to the barriers built to the free flow of ideas, people, and commodities have attracted critical scrutiny from many quarters, most of all among expansive social forces pushing the project of globalizing the market economy, and above all in business and government, and mostly in the West. Contemporary border problems suggest that our cover photo can serve as a metaphorical reference to the fencing of national territory. Israel is, of course, a leader in that fencing endeavor, now being joined by many countries, notably the US and India, making the border fencing business ever more lucrative, which in turn makes fencing borders more popular. But the fence merely intensifies border discipline. It's just another additional technology of border enforcement. The fence in this photo thus implicitly refers, in my reading anyway, to the recent heightening of security state paranoia and to popular efforts to evade its barricades and punishments, which afflict poor people moving from place to place, looking for work most painfully. We can thus imagine this photo depicting a borderland space of confrontation between social forces of mobility and spatial flow on the one hand, and territorial forces of enclosure and self-defense on the other. This confrontation involves horizontal spatial mobility on the ground, at sea, and in the air, actually, but also vertical social mobility, moving up the ranks of wealth and well-being, because barriers to upward social mobility also appear in the form of territorial constraints on physical mobility, since moving up in the social world, getting richer and more respectable, typically means moving from poorer to richer places. Our apartheid provides an excellent example of physical constraints on social mobility. Fences enclose richer places, like the gated communities that now typify urban prosperity globally, and fences are built to keep out threatening people, with gates inserted in the fences and walls to regulate the mobility that provides richer employers and consumers necessary goods and services. When I was in Johannesburg recently, I was treated to a tour of the city in which I noticed, was pointed out very markedly, that special trains ran from only for Africans from the townships to work in downtown Johannesburg. A huge gate, we might say, with a special delivery mechanism especially for those workers. If there's anything distinctively Asian about Asian borderlands, therefore, it would lie in their modalities of mobility and territorialism. Historically speaking, one good place to look is in agriculture, where people invested in farming have devised territorial institutions, that is, social and cultural technologies of spatial control, to protect their physical investments in the land against threats from outsiders, while at the same time mobilizing labor from outside to work the land and using traders traveling to distant places to generate wealth since ancient times. We can also look for borderland histories and empires, where rulers have likewise over long periods of time sought to expand their control over the mobility of goods and services to benefit dynastic regimes by bringing wealth into protected, privileged places, most notably into their capital cities, rich sites of elite cultural production, monumental grandeur, and awesome beauty. In humble farming villages and in grand empires alike, territorialism has historically meant keeping assets firmly in the grip of privileged insiders and keeping all others outside except to serve and contribute. A vast number of historical sources in Asia pertain to institutions of territorial order, to their enrichment, protection, and expansion, and also, over and over and over again, to their collapse and demise. In every culture that I know, and each in its own distinctive cultural idiom, the stability of territorial order is equated with prosperity, happiness, and moral goodness, and instability with immorality, misery, and suffering. We can reasonably say, therefore, that territorialism is a basic feature of what people like to call civilization, where mobility merits mention in historical records primarily in its relationship with territorial order. Merchants, thus, who enrich the realm are good people. Thieves and enemies and warriors and financial cheats, like moneylenders in rural India, and now hedge fund speculators on Wall Street, are bad. Mobile groups mostly appear in records that are produced for territorial elites who regard themselves as regulators of the moral universe. Old records in many Asian settings allow us to follow the history of territorialism and mobility over millennia. One broad general trend seems to me to be this. As people expand social spaces of mobility over time to generate more wealth in larger areas of productive interaction, territorial institutions become larger and more powerful. All across Asia, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific and from the Silk Road around the Indian Ocean, imperial territories have expanded in size over the centuries. Capital cities getting bigger, with state regimes getting more professionally and massively militarized, exercising more control over larger areas. Trends in mobility and territorialism feed one another. Larger empires expand networks of productive mobility that enrich growing imperial capitals, to expand imperial powers that organize the mobility of people, things, and ideas over larger distances, to benefit imperial elites which grow in size and interact with one another more influentially over longer distances, stimulating economic development in agriculture, industry, and trade. To use some Indian examples, in the first millennium of the Common Era, the Hindu temple with its rituals and arts, the royal palace filled with music and poetry, and the Brahmin Agraharam with its rich irrigated farmland bestowed by kings on worthy experts in the sacred scriptures, all of these were territorial institutions that organized relatively small-scale agrarian domains surrounded and crisscrossed by mobile populations of hunters and warriors and connected to one another by networks of migration and trade over which the rulers and landed elites had very, very little control. The medieval territorial order, and what Sheldon Pollock calls the Sanskrit cosmopolis, consisted of scattered, small-scale domains with intermittent and precarious control over their surroundings. Centuries later, the early modern world of Ottoman, Safavid, Mughal, and Ming and Qing emperors was much better organized territorially, at a much larger scale, as records of many kinds, like the Inequity, for example, attest very nicely. The same broad trend continued through the 19th and 20th century, and like their Asian predecessors, European imperial powers introduced new and more expansive institutional forms of territorial order without eliminating old territorial institutions, which remained in place, particularly at lower levels of scale. Empires expanded by incorporating diverse and often overlapping territorial institutions, producing what some have called layered sovereignty, others have called lumpy or uneven domains of legal order. British India represents an extreme case of European meddling with old territorial order, but legal pluralism and old institutions of agrarian elite control not only remained in place there, but were actually strengthened in many cases by the more powerful modern imperial state. Old elite horizons also expanded in modern centuries with the rise of new urban sites for wealth accumulation, which grew primarily on the coast, where global mobility at sea enriched modern empires in an emerging world economy. Transcontinental and transoceanic networks of mobility among coastal port cities made them the most powerful nodes of territorial order in the modern world until very recently, maybe even today. Over the centuries, in fact, the city itself became an increasingly powerful territorial institution. Perhaps we could say that they formed the leading institution, represented beautifully by the Mughals' great forts, walled cities, and palaces, by the Ming Forbidden City in Beijing, and by fortified cities wherever seafaring Europeans occupied the coast. Urbanism and urban networks formed by lines of transport and communication and by flows of people, ideas, and commodities provided strategic, privileged nodes for investment, capital accumulation, and expansive territorial control. Capital cities got bigger and bigger as central place hierarchies became ever more intricately layered, with cities and towns and villages forming status ranks that ranged widely under metropolitan heartlands of empire, forming vast imperial systems of territorial order, with people ranked territorially by the imperial stature of their local habitus, and embracing the vast spatial expansion of intensive agricultural production and industrial production as well, which gobbled up the landscape in the early modern period, stretching into the 19th century. Urban networks of social power, spreading across ever-expanding imperial territories, marginalized, isolated, and delegitimized all human life ways that did not contribute to imperial expansion. The spatial unevenness of this incorporation produced what Willem van Schendel has called zomia, more than did the purposeful cultural histories of escape from state power as proposed by James Scott, at least in my view. National maps that we see today thus emerged in Asia inside very long spatial histories of mobility and territorialism. As modern empires organized socio-spatial power relations with increasing rigor around urban centers that became the elite modern habitus for national politics, and as aspiring national citizens became invested in imperial territories which they in turn naturalized as their own national inheritance. Over and again, empires had bolstered their legitimacy with efforts to generate territorial prosperity, and their collapse repeatedly appears in the historical records as a moral failure. Nationalists likewise bolstered the nation's claim to natural superiority over the empires of old with promises and programs of economic development to promote national prosperity. Nationalism everywhere denigrated empire for causing endless misery and suffering. National borders and borderlands in Asia are, thus, today, products of a highly moralistic historical transition during which Asian nations displaced European empires. Asian national territories absorbed most of the substance of imperial territorialism, however. National boundaries enclosed old imperial status ranks and cultural forms of authority. Expansive systems of motley, multi-layered imperial incorporation gave way to legally bounded, standardized national territory. Asian cultures transformed very old Asian imperial logics of status ranking into national logics of membership and belonging. It is important to emphasize here that national territorialism divided insiders and outsiders in many ways, at many levels of scale, all at once and all over the world. The nation became the first truly global territorial institution, covering the planet entirely during the 20th century. The world of nations spread similar territorial institutions everywhere, most notably with national boundaries which enclose legally sovereign territorial governments, excluding outsiders, and privileging insiders in proportion to their status inside national ranks of central places and social groups. Asian borderlands are distinctively Asian because Asian nations enclosed old spaces of mobility and territorialism in a worldwide process that defined national territories everywhere in basically the same terms, which are certainly not Asian originally. In that sense, national territories and borderlands in Asia did not define themselves. National territories are actually not indigenous anywhere, I would say. Pretty obvious. They all depend for their legitimacy on a world of very unequal national territorial interactions. In that world of richer and poorer, weaker and more powerful national territories, the spatial scale of territorial order continued to expand. In our current age of globalization, which began in the late decades of the last century, national states have become increasingly well-integrated units of territorial management inside a world organized with increasing rigor around the logic of market operations. The rigorous logic of markets suffused national territorialism in much of the world, including Asia, under the impetus of structural adjustment programs, which used poor national government needs for finance to support their sovereignty and development, to homogenize and coordinate spatial logics of market-based mobility and proprietary territorialism. Powerful social groups, especially in business and government, are now deeply invested in expanding the spaces of mobility through markets by enforcing suitably supportive modes of territorial governance. The gated community, the national border fence, and the war on terror are all practical features of a global territorial order that is organizing mobility of goods and services through markets inside structures of territorial inequity, which separate those who belong inside from outsiders who are allowed entry only with caution and under stricter and stricter surveillance. The intensity of territorial control has also continued its historical trend of increase, along with its spatial scale, producing complicated ranks of insiders and outsiders at many interdependent levels of scale. Nations tossed empire into history's dustbin and then rapidly surpassed the rigor of territorial control enforced by imperial regimes. In Asia, the end of European imperialism brought a vast expansion of national state territorial control over spaces of mobility which had been weakly regulated by empires, notably in mountains and forests and in regions of indirect rule. Zomia became dotted with more nodes of control over its spaces, as described very nicely by Nicholas Farelli in a forthcoming edited volume edited by David Gellner, to which Willem has an afterward. Formerly motley collections of disparate territories incorporated by empires over the centuries became unified quickly by national states using technologies of internal and external boundary making in which masses of people became deeply invested. Investing in the nation and its people to enhance economic development meant investing inside national territory to benefit national citizens and largely to exclude outsiders from the benefits. The closure of territories cut from empires by nations defined by language, religion, and ethnicity also produced exclusionary majoritarian politics that subordinated and excluded minorities, foreigners, poor and weak groups, and others living outside the national mainstream or challenging the nation's territorial self-image, even though they lived inside the nation itself. National unity fostering economic growth has been exclusionary and inequitable at many levels, some very visible. Foreign workers from across the border remain alien wherever they go. Borderlanders from the other side of the border thus wear the stigma of alien identity even when living in the heart of the nation. At a larger, more visible level of scale, in a very state-organized part of Zomia in northeast India, we see that recent violence in Assam has featured local ethnic Bodo militias using claims to territory that were granted by the state to justify attacks on so-called alien invaders in their land, who are tainted in the press as being illegal migrants from Bangladesh. Separatists in Srinagar, Kashmir, meanwhile, assert national claims to all of Kashmir against Indian claims that they represent evil foreign enemies. Hindu nationalists in Gujarat have killed Muslims who have lived there for centuries, claiming them to be aliens in India, forcing them to leave the state or move into ghettos and refugee camps. Examples of this kind from many countries seem virtually endless. Flat national maps, evenly colored, border to border, depicting a comprehensive, uniform coverage of national authority, order, and belonging, implied that the borderland is a meaningful spatial concept only at the edges of the nation, where two legitimate national claims to land and people meet on each nation's periphery. This appearance is more than deceptive because we can readily see that external borders constantly haunt people inside the nation, where internal border making is also increasingly essential inside the global regime of market-driven economic development, which accentuates divisions between richer and poorer people and places as people move inside and across national borders from poor to richer urban areas. The territorial inequity of global capitalism is not confined to inequality among nations. New kinds of global borderlands are emerging inside national territories everywhere to separate more urbanized national core zones for accumulating wealth from peripheries of a political and economic neglect, deprivation, exploitation, where people can only move up in the world by moving to the city, thus providing a flood of cheap labor from the countryside and potential trouble for megacities, which are growing most rapidly in Asia. The World Bank has recently announced that Dhaka is in fact the fastest growing megacity in the world. Borderlands of globalization are most expansive and heavily populated in Asia. Like the alien immigrant, the poor villager in the fast-growing Asian city lives under constant threat of hunger, assault, and deportation in what Mike Davis usefully calls the planet of slums. Inside urban settings that are also replete with wealth and prosperity, where opulence emerges from alliances between business and government, described nicely for India by Atul Kohli. This leads us back to where we began, to propose a more literal interpretation of the photo that Willem took on the cover of the conference brochure. The urban borderlander there can now be imagined as a recent rural migrant struggling to pass through barriers or climb fences that divide insiders from outsiders in a global market regime, symbolized by the territorial discipline of megacity sprawl, skyscrapers, shopping malls, highways, airports, gated communities, all protected by armed security guards, if not the army. This boundary making is not producing essentially Asian borderlands. Doug Massey and Mary Fisher, in fact, refer to the United States when they describe these ominous trends in the concentration of affluence. Since 1950, they say, affluent people increasingly have come to inhabit states and metropolitan areas characterized by concentrated affluence. And since 1970, they increasingly have come to reside in affluent tracts as well. The growing concentration of affluence can be expected to reinforce the advantages already enjoyed by high-income families by virtue of their superior purchasing power, access to first-rate services within safe, secure, and resource-rich environments. To the extent that the affluent are increasingly concentrated in affluent areas while the poor remain stuck in poor areas, moreover, their material and political interests will diverge. Although class segregation and the spatial concentration of poverty may no longer be increasing, their persistence in historically high levels when juxtaposed to the growing concentration of affluence at all geographical levels portends a divided society that runs counter to the egalitarian ideology of the United States and its historical commitment to equality. We could say this about many countries, certainly India. Similarly between Asia and America, similarities between Asia and America, what W.F. Wertheim once called East-West parallels, are instructive. The globalization trend in Asia began in Asia with structural reforms in the 1980s, propelled at the same time under Ronald Reagan in the U.S., and continued since then under U.S. Democrats and Republicans, indicating a structural shift in the connection between politics and economics in Asia and America, where there seems to be no political path available today to counter growing market-driven inequality. Most national political economies are now rigged, in fact, so as to maintain or increase inequality in the foreseeable future. This situation resembles a situation a century ago under a similarly free market regime inside the world of empires, which crashed economically in 1929, when the Great Depression made further increases in inequality politically intolerable and provoked revolutions in Asia. In 1940s and 1950s, economic inequality declined dramatically as national states enclosed their economies, and inequality remained relatively low until 1980, but since then, inequality has zoomed back to 1929 levels and beyond. Scholars should be looking more closely at contemporary globalization in light of trends spanning the long 20th century. Borderlands of inequality are much more spatially complex today than national statistics and national maps allow us to comprehend. They require intensive local study. But the current trend, like similar trend a century ago, is also global in scope. It has been accelerated by structural adjustment programs that reduce public expenditure on economic support for the population, increase import-export dependency, and magnify the political power of finance capital everywhere. The late 20th century has reintroduced a variety of the pre-1929 free market regime that Karl Polanyi described as a policy framework which alienated state economic policy from its social moorings. As early as 1893, Emil Durkheim theorized that social upheaval and dislocation would increase with what he called abnormal inequity in a world where imperialism had already begun to provoke variously radical strands of nationalism. A century later, the production of new borderlands formed by territorial inequity inside global capitalism remains, however, largely invisible in scholarship and in public culture alike. This can be partly explained by mass media filters, but also more broadly by the wide dissemination of ideas and cultural values of individualism and consumerism that support a neoliberal cultural hegemony among the learned rising rich, the educated middle classes, the well-informed media, and even the very most well-meaning politicians. Sigh. I mean, what to do, okay? Nevertheless, inequality did return quietly to the agenda of development economics in the 1990s, when the UNDP's 1996 Human Development Report showed that globally, in the previous 4 decades, the ratio of wealth held respectively by the richest and poorest quintiles of the world population had almost tripled. The UNDP then reported that the poorest 20% of the world's people saw their share of global wealth decline in 30 years, while the share of the richest 20% rose from 70% to 80%. This trend was also rapid in the U.S., where between 1980 and 1996, the richest 20% increased their share of national income from 44 to 50%, and the richest 1%, and this is in the 1990s, had increased their proportion of the wealth 6 times more, from 7 to 13%. Under the Clinton regime, 20% of the U.S. population owned 84% of all private assets, and the U.S. was already more unequal, the rich being more separated from the poor by a wealth gap more expansive than at any time since 1929. Inequality has hit the headlines briefly now, but it has been growing mostly invisibly at a more rapid pace for the last 2 decades, as it did in the decades before 1929. In 2005, the UN report on the world social situation, entitled The Inequality Predicament, warned that increasing inequality in the social control of wealth all across Asia, in the West, in the North, and the South, and in the world as a whole, threatened to undermine economic growth by depressing effective demand, and to undermine political stability by reducing popular attachments and feelings of belonging inside national state regimes, thereby provoking alienation and unrest. But who was listening? And, after all, is there anything specifically Asian about Asian borderlands of global inequity? That, I think, remains to be seen, because the question is rarely asked. But India does provide a good example of a nation where the answer may lie in the fact that its elites have reproduced forms of social and territorial inequity inherited from empires of old. After independence, India's national development regime increased economic growth and prosperity more than British imperialism ever could, but it also actually accentuated disproportionate wealth accumulation among people and places that were already privileged at various levels at independence in 1947. National development policy, to quote its critics, bet on the rich to secure economic growth. In 1980s, the upwardly mobile social strata, who had benefited most from their status in the British imperial ranks and also in India's regime of national development, propelled the government to return to a free market policy regime like that of the British, which was, by the 1980s, no longer identified with empire and with colonial oppression, but was now identified rather with being progressively and proudly Indian. Post-colonial cultural studies and subaltern studies emerged inside this return to the colonial economic policy, without actually referring to its existence. In 1991, after a decade of national debt-driven growth, India joined a global trend by returning to the same kind of free market export-oriented economic policies that prevailed in 1914. By then, inequality among Indian states had been increasing along inherited lines since the 1960s, and today spatial inequality among states is seen to be a serious problem in India, having remained entrenched in spite of planning and increasing after 1991. Richer regions have gotten steadily richer compared to poorer regions. After 1991, inequality increased faster and more broadly. Gini coefficients of income inequality have risen since 1999. In 2004, National Sample Survey data showed that new wealth produced after 1991 went mostly to wealthier classes with privileged access to government and new market opportunities. The urban rich benefited most. The top quintile of the urban income groups increased their own consumption by 40%. The rural rich got richer than their land poor and landless neighbors, but they got poorer compared to urban rich, and leading richer and poorer rural groups alike to move into the city. In 2004, the new Prime Minister had to face the sad fact that 600 million Indians in the bottom 80% of rural income groups had suffered a steady decline in their per capita consumption, which continues, by the way, today, under reforms that he had introduced as finance minister in 1991. Manmohan Singh could, however, feel good that 300 million Indians, citizens, did get richer under liberalization, and the richest among them became media stars for his aggressive ad campaign promoting India as the world's fastest-growing free market democracy. This growing gap between rich and poor forms the borderland of territorial inequity in the world of globalization. Borderlands separating the rich and poor in Asia are becoming ever more densely populated, sickly, uneducated, young, and politically volatile. But they remain today barely visible. Some of this invisibility is no doubt the result of intentional exaggeration of the grandeur of the sparkling spectacle of globalization, and much of it is explained by the isolation of poverty as an economic issue to be solved by better economic policies. But the invisibility of barriers and borderlands separating rich and poor emerges, I think, very broadly also emerges from habits of scholarship that separate studies of political economy from those of society and cultures, as indicated by the blindness of post-colonial studies to increasing inequality in Asia. I'm concerned in this respect for the future of borderland studies. The spaces inhabited by the struggling poor inside national territory appear in most scholarship to be a kind of habitus that is defined by national cultures and by state regimes, rather than ones being produced in front of our eyes inside national territorial systems of socio-spatial inequity embedded in the world of global capitalism. In that world of invisible inequity, for example, the ongoing revolution in that large part of Zomia that is Nepal appears to be a conflict among ethnic groups based in regions struggling for national representation. And Maoist rebellions in Indian mountain regions appear to be diverse regional collections of various radical responses to local disruption. In that world also, we can read about partition narratives that still complicate national identities in the Sundarbans and other areas, without learning how combinations of political and investor power are driving rice farmers off the land to make room for shrimp factory farms that have produced delicacies for urbanites overseas. Many such examples could be brought to bear to elaborate my final observation that ethnographies of borderlands need to take borderlands of global inequity more seriously. This is where I will end, happily for everyone, I'm sure, with a few other observations or considerations that I'd actually like to present for discussion. And I guess you could call it Q&A, but I like the idea of conversation much better. I'm no ethnographer, but contemporary borderlands of global capitalism need to be studied up close and in person by people who are doing ethnographic work. So this is not a kind of work that I can do. It's possible to integrate or do team types of work that would link together ethnography with historical or other types of research. Statistics and archives can reveal some general patterns and general contours of borderlands of inequity, which need recognition, which need visibility, which need to be highlighted, need to be brought to light in order to be studied ethnographically. We can see the growing wealth gap. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that we can just begin to imagine the growing wealth gap as a borderland and obstacle, like the fence, to physical and social mobility that's similar to a territorial borderland around, or analogous to a borderland around a state, a physical border. And we have to figure out a way, I think, to integrate our understanding of territorial means to control mobility and upward mobility in particular inside power relations of territorial inequity. I actually, just by chance, have stumbled across a couple of interesting, I guess you could call them possible case studies or something of that sort. And I just thought I would share them with you a little bit. One is, first of all, obviously, this kind of work requires work inside a country in addition to along its borders, so that the physical borders of the state or of the national territory are really not themselves the issue, but rather all the territorial features of everyday life that stand in the way, or even, you might even say, facilitate the mobility of populations in this world of inequity. I stumbled upon one such scene where one can find this work in the 1990s in southern Tamil Nadu, when a friend and I went down to study caste violence in Tirunelveli district. What we discovered was the violence was being perpetrated upon untouchable workers who had traveled to the Gulf and who had returned to spend their money on things like fans and radios and cooking gas and all sorts of things that made their households better, who decided to dress their children, particularly their girls, up and put them on buses and send them to school with new textbooks and so on, all bought with the proceeds of their work in the Gulf. They did all this until and before and up until the time when they were attacked by their caste superiors in the village, who resented their mobility and their improvement of their lifestyles. We heard dramatic accounts. In fact, we heard them over and over again from all sorts of villagers. Actually, they were so repeated and so rehearsed and narrated and almost dramatically composed that we began to realize that for the people in this area, they actually conceptualized this problem of this caste violence precisely in the terms that I'm trying to describe as a structural and very territorial obstacle to their upward mobility. Another good example that I discovered was a very interesting one. That, in other words, figuring out how to study this kind of problem is actually quite difficult. But one of the ones that it occurred to me was I went on a tour of the Sundarbans island areas where these shrimp farms were being expanded, and all of a sudden I realized that these farmers were being actually pushed off the land by the shrimp entrepreneurs, and with the backing of the state political forces, and basically forced out of their livelihoods, away from their ability to farm, into actually much less lucrative ways of life, and a whole bunch of them had migrated to the city. In general, it seems that it's probably difficult to do this kind of research without going to the city and figuring out where people are coming from and why they're coming from where they're coming from and what's going on where they're coming from that forces them into the city. But I was just thought of, on the way over here just now, I just thought of another kind of counterexample, kind of a research possibility would be the study of the Grameen Bank and its microcredit borrowers. It's a subject that's become a lot more popular of late. Poor Muhammad Yunus is suffering a lot of troubles with the government of Bangladesh, but even before that, there was critical research coming out concerning the Grameen Bank, which, despite the fact that you can like Muhammad Yunus, you have to realize that it's desirable to have such research be done. And one of the interesting features about the research, probably the main feature, was that the publicity for the Grameen Bank, which constantly trumpeted the success of the women who were borrowing the loans, who were borrowing microcredit loans from the Grameen Bank, was significantly overstated the reality that was going on, and that there were in the villages, in their everyday lives, real everyday obstacles to their using these loans in any kind of productive or profitable way. So, in other words, but some women were doing well, and other women were doing badly, and so on. So, the idea of studying these kind of mobility projects in different types of environments seems to me to be a very useful way to go about getting at the borderlands that are formed by territorial inequity in the world of globalization. The end. Thank you for your patience.